slash Still's disease. And we've been around for almost like, I think, 6 years, 7 years but since the foundation was formed, but longer than that in terms of when we've been doing our work. We focus a lot on research and on helping the patients who have refractory disease and how to work with researchers to help find new treatments. And this is kind of our effort to start working directly more with parents and patients and help them with the types of needs that they have. And in that ways, we are excited to have Nicole with us. I'm going to pass you to Luciana, who's going to tell you a quick little about the foundation and the type of things we do, and then we'll jump into Nicole's talk. Luciana.
Can you see my screen? Yes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, it's great to be here, like one more session, like when we have the parent here. So I want to speak a little bit about the foundation, and this was the last event, like the in-person event that we were all there. So Hashmi, me, Nicole, and Hani, and other parents here. So we had the last Next Gen now in November in Washington, D.C., and this is a very important event for us because this conference is really focused on research. So we had doctors from all over the world, and this is a huge event for the foundation. So here is everyone that was there. So this time we had, I think, almost all the continents. We had people from Asia, U.S., Europe, and South America, and parents and FDA and EMA, and also it was a hybrid event and open to everyone to attend. And where you can find us, so most people probably know us, but I just want to really put it here, and I'll share the links if you guys don't have any of this places that you can find us. And here are also some resources that we decided to list. In our site, you can find clinical trials if you're looking for SJIA clinical trials or some trials related to new meds that are on the pipeline. We also have patient stories. You can go to YouTube where we have 138 videos. So this is really great resources even to share with the doctors, because some sessions, they are really like science sections and doctors discussing cases. So this is really a good resource. Also, we have medical publications that the foundation has been involved with. And also we have the international registry. I don't know if all of you are on the registry that Honey was also working a lot at it. And we have some blog posts with the latest news. And now we have the education accommodations. What is this session is about? And after the session, I will share this with you. This will be on the site. So everything that Nicole was working, it's already on the website, and you can also download these materials, because it can make easier when you go to talk with the schools, or it can get you some tips, especially these fact sheets. Sometimes it's easier to hand out to school staff, so they don't have to go all through the 504. So just something to be really practical and in a daily basis. So here is the registry, and then I'll pass this on to Honey, because she was the one working on it, and also to talk about the SWOT. So Honey, now with you.
Yeah, so the registry, if you guys are able to join it, if you haven't, it's really important because that helps us see what is happening with all the patients out there internationally, and also we are requesting that that there's an update that is provided annually, so we can see how your kids are doing, and see what areas we need to push for in the areas of research where in terms of care and whatnot. So so it's really important for us to kind of gather that information, also present it at NextGen to all the experts around the world who are working on finding a cause and a cure for SJIA. So, and then about the socks. So this site is live now, where we have these socks. I'm holding them up as well. They're really cute, really comfortable. Or SJIA socks. So they're super cute. They have these characters on them, and I'll put the link also in the chat so you guys can click on it easily. So we have on the top here, we have the microphages in purple, and they're really angry and they're eating everything in sight. So then we have the natural killer cell. And so those are like the ninja looking guys with the swords. And then we have also the T cells, we have the neutrophils, we have the IL-18s. So this is just really, it's really fun for the kids to, maybe learn about it, wear it on their feet. Anyway, so this is great. If you guys, are interested. There's a small cost for them. They're $10. It costs us more like $13, but we're selling them at just a slight loss because we want it to be accessible for everyone. And yeah, so they're on sale on the website right now. So if you do place an order, I'll be the one shipping them out to you. So
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, honey. Yeah, and then our next event, so we are starting to prepare. We have the Rare Disease Day, so it will be, I think, the third year that we'll make the social hour for rare disease. So hope you are all there too. And this is a nice event because we have also the Still's disease patients to join us, the adult ones, so we are able to kind of also talk to them. So please, we'll share the program soon. So just be aware that you get an email, or we'll post in the site. So, okay, so with that, I'll just stop sharing this one. Yeah, so I think that's it from my side. And now we can start talking about the school accommodations. So this is something that has been going on the Facebook group for a while. So every time we kind of talk with people are struggling with the school accommodations. And then we were lucky to find Nicole, yeah, right in NextGen, and we met her and we had a lot of conversations about it. And so we decided to do this session. So Nicole is a specialist in 504 and accommodations, and she has been working with us since November, right, Nicole, to kind of put all this together, and it's really a great material. And I think it will help not only people in the U.S., but because as we are talking about accommodations, it will help everyone. So, and it will depend if you are, sometimes it's easier for you to talk to your school. Sometimes you have to put in writing. So it will depend in your situation. So yeah, okay. So thank you, Nicole. Now, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you guys see my screen now? It looks like you can.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So yeah, today I'm really excited to talk with you guys to talk about 504s and school accommodations. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Nicole Jinier, and I am a mom of a child with SJIA. So I have a 14-year-old daughter, and she was diagnosed in August of 2019. And so I have a couple of years of experience on the mom side as a child that has a 504 or accommodations in the school system. And I have over 20 years of experience providing educational advocacy and training other individuals to provide educational advocacy. So we can talk about it from both sides. I have experience from both sides of that table, and I think that is really helpful when we have these conversations. So What my goal is today is to go over the basics of what a 504 plan is. I won't spend too much time on that because I want to focus more on accommodations as part of a 504. So I'll go over a little bit about the basics of a 504, then we'll talk about accommodations, and at the end, we'll hopefully be able to lead a group activity where we can kind of problem solve and figure out what some accommodations would be based off of symptoms that an individual is displaying in the school system. As we are going through this, I have slides that I want to go through, but anytime I do a presentation, especially for parents, I really like for parents to just jump in and ask any questions. If I'm talking about something and you want more information on it, please just unmute yourself and ask a question. Then I can kind of tailor this information to what you guys are seeking. My daughter is in a private school setting, so I have experience with private school as well as through my educational advocacy, tons of experience in the public school setting. So we'll be able to talk about both of those settings. So the first question we have is, what is a 504 plan? So if you are new to SJIA or you are new to special education in general, a 504 plan is a educational plan that is created to help students with disabilities by ensuring they have equal access to the same opportunities as students without disabilities. So 504 is really about leveling that playing field. And so any child that, the goal of for their accommodations is to make it so they can equally access the education that a non-disabled student can. And so looking at who qualifies for a 504, and I know that IEPs have been brought up a lot in the chats, and as people were talking. So a 504 is separate from an IEP. An IEP and a 504 have different criteria. So it is easier to meet criteria for a 504 plan. And really, to meet criteria for a 504 plan, you need two things. So you need an individual. That student has to have a disability that impacts one or more major life activities. And so that's a very broad category, and that could be things such as walking or concentrating or standing or breathing. It also includes deficits in bodily function, such as the operation of an immune system. And so when thinking about it, pretty much every kid with SJIA is going to meet this first criteria for if they qualify for a 504. So every child with SJIA has a disability that's going to meet this criteria. But the second question is does that disability interfere with the student's ability to participate or benefit from school activities? And so that's where the question comes into, does this child qualify, right? So they need to be able to, their disability needs to impact them enough that they are having difficulty either participating in accessing the school or participating in accessing the curriculum or their education. And so a child with SJIA that maybe had one flare and then was in remission very quickly may not qualify for a 504, but they still may. So, but if a child is having flares up and down or kind of have the smoldering SJIA kind of always present, they should definitely qualify for a 504. Are there any questions about that, about who would qualify for a 504, maybe who wouldn't? If you have a question, you just unmute yourself. I can't see the chat, so I don't know if someone else, if you put something in a chat, maybe if Luciana, if you can let me know and I can answer the question then. Will that work for you?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I want to point out that 504s are guaranteed under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And I won't get into this too much, but it is important for people to understand because this is a civil rights law. And so under civil rights law, it is designed to protect against discrimination. And because of that, every school in the United States that receives federal funding is required to provide 504 supports. And so in the United States, it's very clear any public school, they obviously get federal funding, they need to provide 504 supports. But what most people don't know or they don't understand is that the majority of private schools, with the exception of typically religious private schools, so independent private schools that are not religious, the vast majority of them do receive either direct or indirect funding from the federal government. And there are different ways this happens. There are federal laws that says that the public school in that locality needs to reach out to all the private schools in that locality and ask, hey, do you want some of this money? Well, the private schools are typically going to say yes. Why would a private school say no to free money coming their way? And then the schools are using this money for things like teacher training and technology in the classroom and things like that. And so the majority of private schools do receive either direct or indirect federal funding. And there is a misconception amongst the private schools that sometimes they don't need to provide 504 supports. And so then we maybe need to question them and ask them, are you receiving federal funding? Are you getting funding from your local public school system? If you're getting funding from your local public school system, that's a trickle down money that came from the federal government. Therefore, they are required to provide 504 supports. Or if they have a program such as DARE. So, my daughter goes to private school. They had DARE in 5th grade. It was taught by the local police department or sheriff's department, but that local department, that police department, got federal funding for that DARE program. So now we're talking about indirect funding from the federal government. So it's just important for you guys to know if you have a child in private school, very likely they still are required to provide them with 504 supports. Are there any questions about that?
Not question per se, but like I think this was very surprising to me when you first mentioned it, that private schools fall under. So what would be a way to approach this with a private school? Go and ask them, are you taking any federal funding?
Yeah, so I would just ask them, and I would ask them if they're getting any federal funding, and they might not understand it's federal funding. So I might ask them, are you getting any funding from your local public school?
Okay.
I think someone's asking a question, but I could not hear it.
I think they might have.
I was asking, what about religious private schools?
So religious private schools are typically the exception. So typically religious schools are not getting federal funding. Now that was different during COVID because they did get PPP money. But that money is typically kind of dissipated now. And so I would anticipate that most religious schools this year they're not going to be getting federal funding. But if it's an independent school, so a non-religious school, very likely getting that funding. Are there any other questions about that? And just to give you guys some background, a little more background about myself. So I am currently the vice president. Next year I'll be the president of my daughter's school. She goes to a private school. So I have a lot of kind of insider information, at least in Virginia, VIAS, the Virginia Independent Association for Schools. And so I'm confident that the majority of private schools in Virginia that are non-religious private schools are taking those federal funds from Virginia public schools. So I can say without a doubt that if you're in Virginia, it is very likely, if you're in a private school, that they are getting federal funding somewhere. And so I would really just ask your school in a non-combative way, like, okay, are you getting federal funding? If they say no, okay, I understand. Do you get any funding from your local public school? If they say yes, then that opens up the conversation. Well, if you're getting money from the public school, it's coming indirectly from the federal government. And you might have to pull up a website and show them that it says if they get indirect funding, then they do have to provide 504 supports. And typically the private schools, they don't want to argue that. Once they know they're educated, they're going to move on and provide you with the supports that they are legally required to do. Any other questions on that point?
So my question is, this is based basically in every single state, right? It's just
Correct.
the same general thing, no matter what state you live in.
That is correct, yes. So there's a federal law saying that public schools have to offer some of their funding to the local private schools. So every single public school should be offering funding to the private schools in their locale. Are there any other questions about this? Okay. Okay, so then what's included in a 504? A 504 typically has two things. So it has accommodations, and then it has a limited number of what we call related services. And we're going to spend the most of time talking about accommodations. I think that's where everyone is most interested in learning about. But I do want to touch really quickly on what related services are, because these are really great things that a lot of families don't know about that our kids with SJIA can benefit from. So this is not an exhaustive list, but some related services that our kids might benefit from could be special transportation. That could include something like an alternative bus if they need, wheelchair accessible bus, or it could mean a bus stop closer to their house if they have fatigue or pain in, walking a long distance to their bus stop. It could mean for some kids who would typically be a walker, where they would be expected to walk to school, well, if they have a disability, we can still say, no, we need you to send a bus and pick up the kid from the front step. It could be things like counseling services. And I think that counseling services as a related service is something that I would like to see in probably all of our kids' 504s. If you have a kid with SJIA, whether they are sharing this with you or not, likely they are struggling with it emotionally and mentally. And I can say this from a mental health provider. So part of my experience as an educational advocate is through my work in mental health. I own a mental health and behavioral health medical practice, and so we see this a lot with kids with chronic illnesses and chronic disorders. That majority of them really do benefit from counseling services. So I would recommend, if you have a 504, you're getting a 504, to think about putting counseling services as a support in there for your child. Other things could be occupational therapy or physical therapy. This is one of the services that is sometimes kind of where a divide happens between an IEP and a 504. So if we're talking about what we call consultative services for OT or PT, what that means is the OT or the PT is coming into the classroom, observing your child, and coming up with a plan for them, and then training your teacher. That's what we call consultative therapy services. Those are 100% provided under a 504. Some schools will make a divide that if the child needs direct OT or PT, then that's when we cross over into an IEP. And that's there's no legality there. There's nothing saying they can't provide direct OT or PT under a 504. But that's where some of the schools will make that divide. Like if they need intensive treatment in that way, then the school would recommend they go an IEP route. And I know that somebody asked this earlier, I think I maybe saw it in the chat. A child can have both an IEP and a 504, or a family can choose to have one or the other. And we can talk about that if there's questions about that. The last service that I have listed here as a related service is a nursing service. And that's going to be a really important service for our kiddos that need a one-on-one nurse in school, or for a child who needs to get medication administered in school, or sometimes just for a child who needs to be able to go to the nurse more often than others. Are there any questions about what a related service is, or do you have a question about your child in particular that I can answer about if a related service might be beneficial for them?
Yeah, Carissa is asking here on the chat, like my question, whenever you get it, is do you have a 504 and IAP together, or is it only one or the other?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So you can have both, or you can have one or the other. And there is no like very clear-cut answer, and there's no very clear-cut legal as to like, okay, you should not have an IEP and you should have a 504. So it's a very individualized decision. If your child needs modifications to their academic program, meaning we need to change the amount of work they're doing, or they need to be with a special education teacher or something like that, then they need an IEP. So modifications are not provided under a 504. So a difference between a modification and an accommodation. An accommodation makes it so your child can complete the normal, typical school work, whereas a modification modifies the expectation. If we are modifying the academic expectation, you need an IEP. If we're just looking at making it easier for your kid to accomplish this task, then a 504 might suit. They are covered by different laws. Right. So, and when we talk about the legality of it, hopefully none of you are in this situation, but as an advocate, I've been in lots of situations where I'm in, mediation rooms or courtrooms, and there's lawyers involved as we're, advocating for kids to get really robust special education services. If you feel like you're kind of in that situation, in all honesty, a 504 has in a lot of ways more federal protection because it is a civil rights law, whereas an IDEA IEP law is a little bit softer. Schools are a little bit less afraid of the IEP regulations than they are about 504 regulations. And I don't feel like I answered that question very well. So what was the specific question? I'm sorry.
If it's like one or the other. So I think like you can have both, right?
You
If
can have both. Yes, you absolutely can have both.
yeah, and she added that she has an OT and modifications. And then another comment is that I think she falls right smack in between that.
Yeah, so she says she has OT and modifications, so modifications to the school. Is that what she said?
Yep.
Then she should have an IEP. So if you are having modifications, then you should have an IEP, because modifications are not protected under a 504. So if we're modifying the expectations, if we're saying this child should do half the amount of work as the other students, or they should not have to complete their homework, that's a modification, and that should be handled under an IEP. Okay. Any other questions about that?
Just she's adding here, but sometimes her flares cause so many issues to get up in the morning. So then her workload is exhausting and it takes a really long time to play catch up at times. So.
Yeah, for sure. So it does sound like to me that she would really benefit from having an IEP, and all of that could be dealt with in an IEP. You could have a 504 in addition to it, but her attendance at school and the modifications of coursework, and if she needs any specialized education to then catch her up, right? Because if our kids are missing a lot of school, then they might need to go to the special education teacher or the resource teacher to help catch them up. And those things are going to be better served probably from an IEP. IEPs are more difficult for the school to put together, and there's more rules around it. So I'm not surprised when a school would rather do a 504 than do an IEP. But for your child's protection, I would recommend an IEP in that situation. Okay. So we'll talk about accommodations a little bit. And this is where we'll kind of spend the bulk of our time. So, keep throwing out those questions because I think it's really helpful. And I can kind of concentrate on the things that are most important to the group here. So, but what is an accommodation? So again, it's going to remove the barrier that might make it harder for your child to learn or complete work. It's going to level the playing field so your child has the same opportunities to succeed as other students. But again, it does not change the academic curriculum. So if we want the academic curriculum or the amount of work changed, that's when we go into an IEP. And if you remember nothing from this presentation except for this slide, I'll be happy. So it's very important to know that you can request anything that will help your child fully access their education or environment. There is no predetermined list of accommodations, okay? So as long as you are aligning that accommodation with a need, you can ask for it. It doesn't mean they have to honor every single request, but if you identify a need that the child has, they are required then to provide some sort of accommodation. It might not be necessarily the accommodation you want. So let me give you an example. If you have a child that maybe they have arthritis in their hands, and writing is really difficult for them, and typing is really difficult for them, and you want the accommodation of them to have a scribe, so someone to write for them. The school can say, no, we're not going to provide a scribe, but we will provide text-to-speech software. So your child can talk into a computer and it will type for them. So they still met that need, but they might do it in a way that isn't the exact accommodation you've asked for. Does that make sense, everybody? But you can ask for anything. And I think this is really important, especially in the public school system, because one thing I did not mention already, but it's important for you guys to know, is that in 504 plan, unlike an IEP, does not legally have to be a written document. Okay. So it does not have to be a written document, but most public schools will have it as a written document, while most private schools, it's 50-50, whether they're going to write something down with you or it's going to be a conversation or an email or something less formal. But the public schools, I would say probably 99% of public schools or 95% of public schools will write something down. And when they will do that, they'll pull it up in their computer system, just like they do for IEPs. And there will be a drop-down box in their program for most schools, and it will have a list of accommodations. And they will go through and they will say, do you want this one? Do you want this one? Do you want this one? And it's very important for families to know that there's also an option at the bottom of that list for them to type in whatever they want. And so that drop-down box gets it makes it difficult for families when they don't know that they can put other things that's not listed in that drop down box. So you can request anything for your child and do not accept that. You push back on the school if they say, well, that's not one of the accommodations we can provide. Yes, it is. This is a civil rights law. You can provide any accommodation that's going to make it so that my child can be successful in the school system. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll go through some examples of what some accommodations can be, and just kind of explain to you a little bit about maybe why that accommodation would be helpful. And then once I'm done that, I'm hoping that, we'll pull up, like the first one will be fatigue, and then together we can kind of brainstorm if a child has fatigue, what would be some accommodations that could be really helpful for them. And I have some things kind of pre-planned, but we can also, if you have a child that has, fill in the blank, we can kind of do that exercise for that as well. So just to go through some examples, and like I said, they are just examples. We can put anything we need as an accommodation, but you can have accommodations for assistive tools and technology. So you could have note-taking tools, audio or digital learning materials, modified writing tools, right? Any of these things. And these are going to be really beneficial for kids that have fatigue, that have joint pain, maybe that have brain fog, right? They're just really tired and they have brain fog and things are a little more difficult for them. They're a little bit, my daughter has severe brain fog. That's why I bring it up. So things are just a little bit slower for her when she's processing things. And so she does use a lot of these assistive technology devices, and they are helpful for her. One of the biggest ones that we use, and probably the one that most people really think about, is time-related accommodations. So extended time for assignments and tests or frequent breaks. And these accommodations can be really beneficial for kids with SJIA. So you're going to need extended time if your kiddo is missing a lot of school, or if they're not feeling well and it takes them a little bit longer to complete the work. They might need breaks. And it's going to be, especially for this extended time for assignments and tests, it's going to be really important that in your accommodations, when you're talking to the school, or if you do have a written plan, when it's written down, you are specific in how much extended time you're going to ask for. You don't want it to just say extended time. You want it to say double time or 50% more time. You want it to be specific, and justifiable for why your kid needs that amount of time. If, I've seen families, they just put extended time and then it's not honored in the way they expected it to be honored, because they were thinking, well, my kid can get as much time as they want. And the school is thinking, well, I'll give them an extra 10 minutes, right? And so you really want to be specific in what you're asking for and make sure that it is really specified. You will get pushback on anything over double time. So double time in special education is really typically where the threshold is. So, if the, typically developing students or your non-disabled students get an hour to write this paper or do this test, a child with double time is going to get 2 hours to write that paper or do that test. And that's typically the max you can ask for. In my experience, there's nothing written down in any of the laws that says you can't have more than that. But I think that most schools think that anything more than that is unreasonable. So keep that in mind. Any questions about that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
Very silly.
no, so whenever you're doing, like my child that has, like extended time, but we never spoke of how much time. I can go back and ask them, how much time are you guys giving her? Correct?
Absolutely. Yes. You should
Okay.
go back and ask, how much time are you giving her? And if you agree with that amount of time, you should say, great. If you have a written plan, I would say, great. Can we add it to the written plan? And if you don't agree with that amount of time, I would say, okay, I think she needs more. Can we come back to the table and have another 504 meeting?
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Were there any other questions about that?
Yeah, I was just wondering about time-related accommodations in general. And this is as someone who has actually not done a 504, because my son didn't go to school. He was homeschooled for a while, and I just taught him, so he didn't need it at the time. But I'm curious, doesn't it kind of backfire because these kids are fatigued,
Mhm.
and if they're spending more time in doing the work, then they have even lesser time to recover and to do the other things also that they need to do to take care of their health. So it seems to me that time is, we can ask for time, but like, doesn't it sometimes backfire?
So it can, right? Because then things kind of run into other things, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think you have to look at things holistically. So I can give an example of my daughter's schedule. So I have a ninth grade daughter with SJIA, and we have built into her schedule a couple of extra study halls so that her extended time for testing would be eaten up by those study halls. So she's not missing other academic work, because if she was, then you're right. On the weekend, she would just have hours and hours of work to keep up with. So you do have to look at the holistic picture. I will also tell you though, my daughter has very extreme brain fog, and she has arthritis in almost every joint, and she gets really fatigued. And if she wasn't given, she gets double time. If she didn't get double time, she would be a D student. And with double time, she's an A student. She's a straight A student. And so for her, it's an accommodation that is really really, really impactful. But for you're right, for other students, it might not be. And that's why it's so individualized to kind of figure out what is going to be best for your child. If you're asking for that modification, and I realize it says examples of academic modifications here, so that was a bad wording choice I used. If you're asking for an actual modification, though, you can do that through an IEP. And there are a few different categories of disabilities for IEPs that children with SJIA may meet. And maybe we could talk about that maybe a different time if families are interested in IEPs as well.
Yeah. Kind of a follow-up question there.
Sure.
Is that so, given that your daughter is nearing school, like, do these carry on to, I've heard that these can carry on to college and university. Yeah.
So because a 504 is a civil rights law, you have to go through the process again when you go to your school. But yes, colleges and universities, especially if they get any federal funding, they have to provide accommodations to students with disabilities. So yes, and it can also carry over for SAT testing and AP testing and things like that as well. So you might need to get more hefty documentation for those things, but you can still get these accommodations in college. And I anticipate that my daughter will um, still have accommodations when she goes to college.
Yeah.
So I have another question about the, like you said, the double time. When this is given, do you specify with the school, like let's say it's a test, for them not to have the 2 hours or, like an hour and 30 minutes that day, they can like extend it for the next day?
Yeah, so you can have it written like that, absolutely. And that's going to be really individualized for your kid and for your setting. So um,
Break it down.
you can break it down. When my daughter was younger, we would break it down because that was easier for her. Now, I think it's important that we involve our kids in these discussions and these decisions. As she's gotten older and she's in high school, she's writing a paper. She wants to just she wants to sit in her thoughts and think about it and formalize it and just keep going. So now we do kind of cram her, if we can, her 2 hours together. But when she was younger, she needed to be able to get up and move around and just kind of take a break from it. So it really is individualized for that kid.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is one question from Carissa, is what about
Okay.
state testing?
State testing, is that what you said? Yes, yeah. So state testing, yes. So if you have an accommodation for additional time on tests, that does typically transition into state testing as well as SATs and SOL testing and AP testing and things like that. Your school might require more documentation for it, but you should be able to get those testing accommodations for standardized testing. Okay. So any other questions?
She had a follow-up. She said the only thing
Yeah.
that they allowed was additional time, but not text to speech.
Okay, so the accommodation they allowed was additional time, but not text to speech. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question would be, why are you asking for text to speech, and why did they say no to that accommodation?
She answered like long ELA reading on tests, said no because they don't allow it.
Okay, so that answer of no because we don't allow it is not a legal answer. So, is this child in a public school or in a private school?
Allows for regular school, but not state testing.
I think she's saying that the state testing does not allow it. They're in virtual
State
only.
testing. Okay, so the state testing does not allow the text. Okay. And you said they're on virtual learning. So that's a really interesting nuance. I would encourage her to look at the state's Department of Education website and see if that is listed anywhere. Because they're not supposed to deny very specific accommodations. So state testing, each state might have slightly different rules for what they're allowed to do. Um, and if they're trying to get, especially if that standardized test is tied to their standard diploma. And so if you have a standardized test that's tied to the standard diploma, they can have specific rules, and most time those rules will be something like you can't, double time is the max you can have. I've never heard of you can't do text to speech because that would beg the question of what if I had a disability where I didn't have hands, right? Like, what if I had a very severe disability where I could not write? I would have to use text to speech. And so, kind of think about it in that way. Like, is there a kid that you could think of, like, the only way they could do this is text to speech? And if so, how can the state say that's not an option? They can't make that blanket statement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, she just added that she received the same answer in Louisiana and in Oklahoma, so 2 states.
Hmm. I would push back on it. I don't know why that would be. There are going to be children who need text to speech. So if they are saying her child doesn't need text to speech, that's different than them saying we don't do that, right? They can make an argument for her individual child not needing that accommodation, and then that's a very specific denial. But if they're saying across the board, we don't do that, I don't see how that could hold up.
Yeah, and then just adding to that, so it's not their role to say that they don't need, right? Like they can say like they allow or not, but the need will be from a doctor or for someone that said, oh, how does it work?
No, so they can say the child doesn't, they can say that your child's um, deficit is X, and instead of giving you that accommodation, I can give you this accommodation, right? So they can say, like, you don't need that accommodation. You can have the same benefit with this easier accommodation for me to give you. And that might be what's going on there, but they're not explaining that very well. And so the question again would be like if the child has like for you to have a text to speech and really fight that, you're gonna need a physical limitation while the child cannot type. Right? So if you can prove that this child cannot type because they have arthritis in their hands or because whatever reason it is, they should not be able to say, no, you can't have a talk to text device.
So would a letter from the doctor specifying this problem, wouldn't that
That
be sufficient or no?
it would help, right? So we have to remember the doctor doesn't make the decision. The school and the parent together make the decision. But if you can get medical documentation saying it is damaging or hurtful for this student to type on a computer and they need an alternative way, then the school should be required to do that. A text to type is not typically, in my experience, that difficult of an accommodation to get if the child really needs it. Now, if we're just saying like, well, my child is tired and it's easier for them to talk, that's probably not going to fly. But if you're like, my child has a physical disability that without excruciating pain, they cannot type, then yes, there should be no reason for them not to get a talk to text device.
Just she's adding like, this is what I'm having an issue now. Her arthritis is not every day, but we can't predict how she will be on the day of the state testing. And also the school itself isn't an issue anymore. They are amazing, but it's isn't crossing over to state testing.
So, okay, so the way it works a lot of times, the school has to give documentation to the state. So in that situation, I would have the doctor write a very strong letter about how the child's, if their arthritis in their hands is impacting their ability to type, that because of that, they should not be typing. If the doctor makes a recommendation, this child should not be typing, it does make it much more difficult for the state to say, we don't care. Any other follow-ups? No? Okay. Oh wait, I didn't talk about this. Okay. So examples of physical environment modifications. So there's lots of these, right? So especially if your kid has fatigue, has pain, has arthritis in their joints, really thinking about the type of seating, comfortable seating, preferential seating. I think we saw in the chat, we have a kid who's starting kindergarten. I would encourage you to think about comfortable seating for them. When my daughter was younger, she was diagnosed and she was in just starting fourth grade. They did a lot of activities where they were sitting on the floor. Sitting on the floor and getting up was very difficult for her. We need to have an accommodation where she didn't have to sit on the floor. She could stand or she could use a seat that she felt was comfortable. So think about those things, especially for those younger kids, or if you have an older kiddo where maybe the seats are just incredibly hard and incredibly uncomfortable and it causes them pain, then we need to figure out how to get them a more comfortable seat. Access to rest areas is a big thing. So if you've got a kid who has a lot of fatigue or they have, fevers or they have other complications from SJIA, they have lung disease, any of these things, they're gonna be fatigued. And so they're going to need access to rest areas, whether that means just a quiet space, maybe it's with the counselor, maybe it's with the school nurse, but a place where they can, as needed, go and just take a little bit of a rest from the day. Adjustment to PE requirements is a really popular accommodation. So that can really vary from adaptive PE, where they're in a more of a specialized or special education gym class. That is typically an accommodation you can get through a 504, or you could, depending on their school environment, if they don't have adaptive PE, they can have more liberal say in saying whether they can sit out to gym class if they're not feeling well that day. Elevator pass is a really popular one. If you've got a kid that has joint issues or fatigue, whether you think your kid is going to need it or not, put an elevator pass in because it's very easy. They're not going to deny an elevator pass. It's a pretty easy accommodation for them to make. Any questions over here? No. Okay. Examples of attendance and participation accommodations. This, again, we have kids that are sick a lot. They are going to doctor's appointments. Maybe they need more rest than other kids. So maybe they're coming to school late or they're leaving school early for appointments or because they're getting too tired. And so looking at that excusal from attendance policies. And trying to get that written into their 504. So if you know your kid is going to miss a lot of school, especially if you're in a public school system that is known for, truancy offenses and things like that, it's good to have it in your 504 so that you're protected, so that the school is not saying that your child is truant. And there can be an understanding from the beginning that your child might be missing more school due to illness or due to not feeling well or medical appointments. And then again, you have the flexible due dates. Homework, getting more time to do homework, or just being able to, for long projects, taking longer if you need to. If sometimes you'll get a week to do a large project and the child is just too exhausted or too sick midweek and they're not able to catch up. So maybe we need a little bit of extra time for that assignment. This is a big thing that I think that we don't talk about enough, and I talked about it a little bit earlier, but this example of social and emotional accommodations. So I really would recommend that, again, we are putting counseling supports, emotional and social accommodations into children's 504s. So thinking about counseling support for little kids, for younger kids, elementary age kids, peer assistance is really nice. As kids get older, they do not want a peer buddy, but as they're in elementary school, kindergarten, first grade, if you've got a kid who needs help carrying their backpack or needs help, or just needs a buddy to walk to the nurse with or whatever that might be, peer assistance can be really nice. And then communication with teachers. It's going to be really important that The 504 has something about communication with teachers, whether that's communication from the parents to the teachers or from the student to the teachers, really wanting those kind of like frequent check-ins to make sure that our kiddo is doing well and feeling well and is able to continue throughout the school day. I talked about that a little bit more here on this slide. Um, but one thing that we have not touched on is this emergency plan for flare-ups, or just kind of an emergency medical plan that can be part as a 504. If your kid, any child with SJIA could have a flare up at any time. That's the reality of our situation. And so the school knowing what that looks like and then what to do in those instances, right? That's really important. And you want to have that open communication, even if your kiddo is in medicated remission, right? My child was in medicated remission and she's no longer in medicated remission. And it's important for the school to know what a flare up can look like for her and that they need to call me. I need to come get her. I might need to take her to the doctor, whatever that looks like. Any questions about any of this?
Yes. Right now that you brought about medicated remission, what happens to kids that go into unmedicated remission? Do they still get to have the 504? Does it get canceled during that time?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So if you remember when we were in the very beginning, we talked about that criteria for a 504. So if you're in remission, you still have a disability. So you're going to have a disability, right? But the question then becomes, is this disability impacting my ability to access education? And if you're in remission long enough, this likely no, it's not impacting your access to education anymore. And so if you're in, I always tell families if you are in medicated remission, that your child still has medication every day, large amounts of medication every day, likely. And I think that you have an argument to fight for a 504. Absolutely. Because things can change, and your child is on a lot of medication. They are even more immunocompromised than what they were before. And anything, change can happen at any time. If a child is in unmedicated remission and has been in unmedicated remission truly for a period of time and there's no symptoms anymore, I don't think that you have an argument for a 504 plan. Now, some schools will continue it and allow you to continue it. But getting one when you're in unmedicated remission, I think is probably going to be very, very difficult.
But let's say you fall off that, it's easy to get it back, right? Like even like if it's during the half a year,
Yes.
after 3 years being under unmedicated, then they end up in a flare, you can fight back to get it back on board that year.
Yes, 100%. You
Okay.
can request a 504 at any point in any school year. So at any time you have a child with a disability, if their disability starts to impact their school, and I wouldn't wait very long, like I'm talking like it impacted them a little bit, I would be getting a 504 immediately. You want the 504 in place before things get really too difficult for your child. Any other questions about that? Okay. So just a couple of examples of general medical accommodations, access to nurse. You want to make sure that your kid has access to that nurse when they need it. The worst thing, the thing that breaks my heart the most is when I'm doing advocacy and the parents are like, well, my kid asked to go to the nurse and they said, well, can't you wait until lunchtime? No, my kid cannot wait till lunchtime. I want it documented or I want it known from the school that when my child asks to go to the nurse, she can go to the nurse at any point in time. That's going to be really important. If you are concerned about immune compromised, your child being immune compromised, you can request additional cleaning precautions. Might include your child like wiping down their desk with a wipe, or might include the teacher doing that. But those could be included. And then if your child uses any type of medical equipment, there should be staff training for that medical equipment included in the 504 plan. If your child is, using oxygen, they need to know how to use that. What if something malfunctions? What if something doesn't go right? You need to make sure somebody in that building knows how to operate that equipment. Okay. So these were examples of accommodations. And I want to go through a little exercise. I don't know, Rashmi and Luciana, do we still have a little bit more time? I know I'm kind of over my time.
Yeah, and we do have time. But I had a question about this medical accommodations.
Okay.
So, immunocompromised means that you can be at risk from other people or other kids who might have some kind of an infection going on.
Yes.
Are you within your rights to ask for to be informed if another child has something which is infectious?
Yes, so you can ask for not a specific child, right? So, but you can say to the school, if there is an outbreak of a communicable disease in my child's school, I want to be notified about it, right? They're not going to notify you if one kid is sick, but if you've gotten, a cluster of 3 kids in your classroom sick now, you want to know about that. And so the school nurse should be able to notify you of, hey, it looks like there's an outbreak of X, Y, and Z in your child's classroom or in the school in general.
I feel
They will
like by
not
the
share
time,
names, though.
yeah,
I'm good. So ahead.
yeah. By the time it's an outbreak, it almost is too late for our
Mhm.
kids. But we've had those kind of general messages about, this, and we're seeing this in the school. But it was, for an immunocompromised child, I would have acted much earlier. And I'm curious, maybe you can go into this in the discussion, how others are dealing with this, because for me, this is one of my concerns.
Yeah, and it is a concern. And I think that when they're talking about what accommodations they're gonna give, the question always is it a reasonable accommodation, and does it cost, like, is it too burdensome for the school, right? And that does kind of get weighed in there a little bit, just like with ADA and work accommodations as our kids get older and go into the work environment. Looking at, okay, what is the burden here, and then what is the need here? A little bit of weighing that. And so I would say that a child with an compromised immune system, I don't want to wait to the point where the whole school is notified of an outbreak. But I also don't think it's the school is not going to think it's reasonable to tell you every time a kid in that classroom is sick. If you get 2 or 3 kids in that classroom, that's not typically something that would go out school wide, but it is something that you could put as accommodation for your individual child. That your teacher or the nurse says, "Hey, it looks like we got something going around our classroom, or the 5th grade or whatever it is." But they're never going to say, and reason, because it's also protection of that individual student. So if there's one student that's out in your class and they have flu, and the nurse says, okay, we've got a student out that has the flu, well, I'm sure you know which student is out, or your kid knows what student is out, and now we know, like, that one particular kid has the flu, and I think that's going to put the school is going to feel like that's kind of like a FERPA risk for them, or a HIPAA risk for them. So it does need to be a little bit bigger, I think, before you can make that an accommodation, like not just one kid, but maybe a small cluster of kids.
Yes, I can tell you that out of experience with my daughter, because she was, diagnosed when she was in pre-K. And so usually pre-K, kindergarten, 1st grade are like a petri dish of germs
Yeah.
these years. Like they will get sick. So this is the times that my daughter was also severely immunocompromised. Uh, and like she said, they would not tell. They told me you cannot tell you when one kid is sick, but when there's an outbreak of the flu or anything, we will notify you. But also, I made sure that I put in accommodations that my daughter's table will be clean, and like I knew her friend, so I would specifically say I want her friend to be next to her because they knew her, and so they knew to watch out for her. So her peers will help out in that part. And another thing, like for example, during lunch, I was allowed to go during lunch with my child to keep her away from all the area, because lunchtime is one of the areas where it's like so many kids. So that was an accommodation because, like in our area, parents are not allowed to go every day. But because of her, we were allowed to do that. Now, like after COVID, when they didn't allow no parents, part of my accommodation, I was taking my daughter out of school every day during lunch to keep her protected. That
Mhm.
was my personal choice until they accommodate me and putting me in a room with her away from them during lunch. So they will not tell you specifically there's a whole bunch of sick kids. So I had to do that. Now that she's older, she's in intermediate school. She's not as severely compromised, but she still is. She has accommodations where she sits in the edge of the table at lunchtime. So it's like you have to work around ways to still fight for accommodations.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually made it reminded me of an accommodation my daughter had when she came back from COVID. So my daughter did 2.5 years of virtual schooling because when COVID hit was when she was first diagnosed and she was pretty unwell. And so we did virtual schooling. When she went back from virtual schooling, we had an accommodation, and she was in seventh grade. So it was kind of like a flexible seating accommodation where if a child was well enough to be in school, but not well enough that we wanted them around my daughter, she would be allowed to move her seat, right? So she had an accommodation where if a teacher knew someone had a cold, or was just coming back from being sick, or maybe had a little bit of a cough or something, they would separate them as much as they could within the classroom. And she could identify that and separate herself, or the teacher could say, okay, Katie Beth, I want you to go sit over there today.
Yes.
So that was an accommodation and my daughter was still wearing a mask at this time to school every day as well. But that accommodation was really helpful for my daughter. And I think it did help her stay well. Like they would try to physically separate her as much as possible from people who probably should have stayed home, but. Any
Um,
other questions?
Yeah, I
Go
just
ahead.
want to add to the access to the nurse that you mentioned about, like, if someone tells I need to go to the nurse, they should be allowed to. I think
Yeah.
this, like for my daughter, it was a problem of communication, but not like to go to the nurse itself, but more like people to trust her. That if she's saying that she's not feeling well, she really is not feeling well. So this was a big issue, like with friends and teachers, especially in high school, because you have different teachers, and some teachers they don't know you well. So this, I think, it's a big part of communicating with the school. So if they say that they are not feeling well because this disease, sometimes you're feeling well and sometimes you're really not. So, and this was one thing that she mentioned like this: I don't need your pity. I need you to believe me. I need you to trust
Yeah.
me. So this was.
100%. Yeah, especially with teenagers, right? So teachers and sometimes the schools, like the reality is teenagers maybe make up little white lies so they can get out of class, right? But we need it known, we need it documented into their 504. I don't care if you think that's the case or not. That this is documented in her 504 that when she says, I'm not feeling well, I need to go to the nurse, she's allowed to go to the nurse. No questions asked. And that I think that is really an important accommodation for almost any kid with SJIA, their 504, because the symptoms of SJIA change drastically from day to day and drastically within the same day, right? I can send my kid to school in the morning and she seems fine, but by lunchtime she's not feeling well. And we had experiences with teachers who were like, "Oh, she was fine when she got here. She's fine." No, I'm picking her up, and I picked her up from school one day. Um, when she was first sick, before we had our accommodations in place, and the teacher was like, well, I thought she was fine, but I sent her to the nurse. She had 104 temperature. So you need to be listening to the kids. And and so what? If the kid gets over on you a little bit, we need to make safety as the highest priority. And so the kid should be allowed to go to the nurse. I'm really, really feel strongly about that one.
Nicole, there was a question earlier in the chat. I think they were asking about the flu outbreak and the notifications with illnesses. So for those asking for these accommodations, does that go on a 504? And what happens if you lose your 504 because they're still compromised, even though they're in a medicated remission? And then is that up to the school if they will still work with you on that?
Yeah, then that's going to be up to the school. So if that's in your 504 and then you lose your 504 because you no longer meet criteria, then the school is not obligated to give you any additional information. And so it's really important you build those relationships with your school, and or at least not the full school. Maybe you've built a relationship with one teacher who can kind of let you know, hey, this is what's going on, or you build a relationship with the nurse. But yeah, unfortunately, if you don't have an IEP or you don't have a 504, the school is not required to do anything extra for you. Okay, any other questions about that? Okay, so The question I get asked a lot by parents is, okay, we've gone over this list of accommodations. What should I ask for? And I literally tell parents to make a list, get out a piece of paper and a pencil, and make a list on one side of every single thing that your kid is struggling with and be specific in it, right? So everything that your kid is struggling with, write down on a piece of paper on one side. And then on the other side of the piece of paper, once we have our full list of the struggles, on the other side of the piece of paper, we start to line up accommodations with those things. And so instead of looking at what accommodations do I need for SJIA, you need to start looking at what accommodations do I need for fatigue? What accommodations do I need for pain in my knees, pain in my hands, right? If you think of it and break it down in that way, it becomes a lot easier. I would also encourage you to, when you're doing this, making these lists, you involve your older children in the process, especially your middle school, high school kids. They are going to be able to tell you all the struggles they have, but even your younger kids, while you're going to need to do more work with the and come up with more things on your own with the elementary aged kids, they're going to tell you things that you didn't think about, right? Because if you don't have the struggles that they have, then you don't even realize these things, need to be fixed, right? So when my daughter was younger and first diagnosed, I didn't realize that I knew she had arthritis in her feet, but I didn't realize that her shoes were hurting her. So we needed to get an accommodation, as silly as it sounds to me, and I think it is silly that I need an accommodation, but we needed an accommodation for the dress code because the dress code at her school was that you cannot wear Crocs or open-toed shoes. Well, she told me that her shoes hurt her because, putting pressure on the top of her feet. So we needed an accommodation for dress code. But if I didn't have that conversation with a little 9-year-old, I wouldn't have known that. So make sure you are involving your children in the process and asking them, like, what what is making it hard for you, or what hurts in school, or when are you tired, or how do you feel in school, making sure you're really involving them in the process.
So my question is, when do you advise that we should have our kids join the 504 meeting to be part of it?
So to be part of the actual meeting,
Yes.
they are the schools will require them or should require them to become part of the actual meeting at 14. But I like to invite kids around 9 or 10 to start in that process if they're mature enough. By the time they're 14, kids should be involved, and public schools will typically, invite them and request them to be involved. But younger than that, if you have a mature 9 or 10-year-old, I would invite them to that meeting. This is their
So
plan.
they're allowed to join.
They are allowed to join,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. And that's an important thing. Like as kids get older with chronic diseases and disabilities, is teaching them to advocate for themselves and teaching them to say, like, this is what's bothering me and this is what's hurting, or this is what my struggle is. That was a good question, though. Okay, so like I said, we're going to start with what is my child struggling with, and literally get out a piece of paper and write it all down. This is, can be a tedious exercise, and sometimes when we do it, we have a very, very long list because you want to break it down, right? So you don't want to just say my child has SJIA or my child has lung disease or my child has arthritis. You want to break it down a little more than that. My child has arthritis in their hands. My child, maybe their whole body does hurt, and then we can look at that. But if we have arthritis in hands, that's going to be different accommodations than if we have arthritis in knees. If we have fatigue, that's going to be a different conversation, right? So writing a list of what is my child struggling with, and then asking the question, what will make that specific struggle better, right? So we're asking ourselves two questions. What is my child struggling with, and what will make that specific struggle better? And so I thought we could go through this activity if we have time. We have talked a lot, but I think even if we just go through one or two of them, it might be helpful for you guys to kind of start thinking about it in this way. So if we imagine, your child struggles with fatigue. So if you have a child struggling with fatigue, can you think of some accommodations that will help with specifically the fatigue issue? Can anybody think of any accommodations?
Being allowed to arrive late.
Yes, 100%. Being able to arrive late. If your child has fatigue, maybe they need to sleep in a little bit longer, or maybe they need to leave earlier in the day. So any type of accommodation to their school hours would be appropriate for a child with fatigue. Can anyone think of any other accommodations that maybe will be appropriate for a child with fatigue?
Well, how about just being able to go to the nurse's office to rest?
Yes, 100%. Going to the nurse's office to rest. Thank you. think somebody else was saying something as well.
I'd be careful with going to the nurse's office and rest. They usually let my daughter go to the library
Okay. Yeah.
because of germs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be dependent on how like your nurse's station is set up and how big your nurse's office is. Um, you want to protect your child from those germs, but also maybe wanting to go to the nurse. I think that's going to be an individualized discussion. For my daughter, when she's fatigued and she needs a rest, I send her to the nurse because I need the nurse to take her temperature and make sure she doesn't have a fever. Because for her, fatigue, it's going to be a sign that maybe she's developing a fever. And so I need her to be watched or at least have her temperature taken before then maybe she does go to the counselor's office or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, Carissa wrote extra breaks.
Yeah, extra breaks. Absolutely. So let's see, what did I write? I wrote extended time, um, elevator pass, modified school day, rest time, more study halls. There really is an endless amount of accommodations you can have, but what you need to learn how to do in order to appropriately advocate for your child is to line up the specific need or the specific struggle, in this case, fatigue, with very specific accommodations that are going to help fatigue, right? Because if you go in and you start saying, my kid is SJIA, and here's a list of all the accommodations I need, without the explanation of, I need this accommodation because of this specific issue, you're much less likely to get the accommodations that you want. But if you go in and you say, my child has fatigue, and because of the fatigue, she needs an elevator pass or she needs extended time. Now they will have to argue that either that extended time is not needed because of the fatigue, but you've identified the child has fatigue, so now they're going to have to give you something else to accommodate that fatigue. And so it's really important that you're always starting with what the struggle is and going from there. Does that make sense to everybody?
Well, like for myself, like a couple of years when my daughter was, flaring, and that's one thing that I felt that I had pushback on, because the mornings is when she was like not doing good, and so it would take a little extra time for us to take her to school, and I told them she needs time to get to school because she's going through flares.
Yeah,
They kind of like frown on that. They're like, well, no, try your best. And if she doesn't feel good, she can go to the nurse. But kind of like pushing me that no, she's still going to get, too many absences. She's going to be considered absent if she's late the first hour of school. And, you're going to have to the point that you're going to have to bring a doctor's note. Your excuse is not going to be sufficient after a certain amount. So it will be like, okay, that's kind of ridiculous, messaging the doctor every day, even though she doesn't have to go to the doctor because we can deal with it. Why am I going to bother the doctor every single time?
sure. Yeah, and so what I would tell you to do in this situation is ask your doctor to write one letter saying that because of this struggle, I anticipate that my patient is going to be late frequently to school, and to ask specifically for her to have that accommodation to miss school. Um, and typically, if you get the doctor to write that, it is much easier conversation. Now they have something on file from a medical doctor, so that when it sounds like this is probably a public school, so that when
Yes.
when the State Department of Education comes in, this is what happens. The State Department of Education comes in and they audit stuff and they go, why is this kid never in school? Right? They need something in that child's educational record to justify it. So you could get a letter from your doctor, and then once you have that letter from the doctor, it should be much easier for you to get that written into your 504. And then the reality is that schools can be difficult. Like I said, at some point in this conversation, I have been in many courtrooms and many mediation rooms with many lawyers involved over stuff that is ridiculous that a school doesn't want to do. And so the best way to combat that is to build as many good relationships as you can, because unfortunately, whether we like it or not, the better relationship you have with the person making that decision, the more likely it is that they are going to honor your request. But I would always say that if you have medical documentation, it makes the argument much, much easier. Any other questions about that? And I don't want to, like, this is not, sometimes this is easy for families and sometimes it's really hard. And, depending on what school you're at, will depend about how much pushback you get from the school. Some schools are just really difficult to work with. If you're in a public school setting and you are having a lot of difficulties, this every state does have at the Department of Education of that state individuals who are parent liaisons. And if you can't get anywhere with your individual school, you can reach out to the parent liaison. And their job is to help the parents. Even though they work for the Department of Education, their job is to help the parents. And oftentimes they can explain to the school that what they're doing is not legal. And when someone from the Department of Education explains to a school, like, hey, what you're doing is not really legal, the school gets on board really quickly. So if you can't get the job done just at your school level, go to the Department of Education's website for your individual state, if you're in public school, and look for that parent liaison position. And then you can send it, their email and phone number is probably listed on the website.
So the parent liaisons, they're different from like parent advocates.
So an advocate is typically not like employed by the school system, right? So an advocate is someone you typically hire externally. They come in and they kind of fight for you and they advocate for you. A liaison, right, for the school system, and they might every state might call it something different, but if let's just say it's called a parent liaison, their job is to help mitigate issues before they become too big. Every school wants to avoid going to mediation with a parent because the public school in their locality didn't provide them 504 IEP support they were supposed to. And so I have many times recommended that families contact this liaison. And at least in our state, in Virginia, that individual has been able to reason with the schools enough that like we can work with them, we can get what we need done. So I
I
just want
have
to guys,
I have an example where last year, this year has been really good to us, but last year my daughter missed over 50 days of school, and I had a confrontation with the principal because, like again, I will go every day during lunch, and she out of nowhere didn't like that, and she kind of confronted me and like questioning me, which I felt disrespected, and I kind of sent her a letter because at that moment I didn't think of what she told me because she just like threw me off guard. But I like wrote her a really professional letter how I felt disrespected and how I told her you don't you should know better basically of what you said. Well, I felt like she kind of wanted to take revenge on me. So when her 504 came, she threatened in front of it was like this is the first time I had a 504 with like two people from the district and from the attendants. It was like more people than we usually get on the 504.
yeah.
And the principal was there. And she said that due to my daughter missing so many schools, she may be considered retaining her out of nowhere. And I was like I was so confused because I wasn't feeling good either. So when she told me this, she says, I also want every time that she gets out of school, like it's gonna be absent to you for you to notify us that she's gonna be absent that day. And I told her that's not acceptable, especially because I'm stressing on her infusions. I'm talking to the nurses. I'm talking to the doctors. I don't have time to say, hey, I'm on my way to the hospital. So it became so overwhelming that I reached out to the hospital and they offered an parents advocate for free through the hospital, and I didn't even know they had that. And I spoke to one of the teachers. She says, "Don't worry about it. I don't know what's wrong with that principal. And first of all, we don't usually see principals at 504 meetings, so it was something like she wanted to get back at me." Well, it's like I right away I just want to advise parents that when these situations happen, don't be intimidated, even from like get to the superintendent, get to whoever you need to, and thank God the problem was solved. My daughter had A's and B's, so like why would she be retained because of her absences? So
And was the attendance, Paul, like was the accommodation for attendance
yes,
already in her 504?
yes, it was there. That's why it blew me off guard, and so that principal is no longer there. But it's like, I just want to advise others that don't feel intimidated when things like this happen because, they can't do that, even though they make it seem like they can.
Yeah. And I will say that the schools sometimes don't understand 504 and IEP law as well as they should. I've been in lots of IEP meetings and 504 meetings where I'm literally reading the law to them from their own handbook from the Virginia Department of Education, like reading their own regulations to them. Um, so the school sometimes they're wrong and they don't even know that they're wrong. Um, and in those instances, like in the instance you're talking about, either either I would guess the 504 was not clear enough or there was just some animosity there. And in that situation, I would definitely recommend that you get an advocate of some sort. An educational advocate can go a really long way because they can talk about the law, they can take emotion out of it, right? If an advocate, it's different talking and advocating for someone who's not your own child. It's very emotional when it's your own child.
Yeah.
And so taking that away from it. And if you can't have an advocate, then going to a meeting with a friend who's going to be able to be less emotional and having that conversation with them beforehand of, what you're looking for, and what you need from this meeting. Because what I do find is that parents in that meeting, they get heated, and teachers in that meeting get heated, and sometimes principals and vice principals, um, they get heated as well. And then if you have people from central office, which is, it sounds like you have people from the county there, not just from your independent school.
Yes.
That gets much more difficult. I would always recommend, and I always recommend to all families that who's going to be in that meeting before you walk into that meeting. And if somebody that you didn't expect is at that meeting, you leave. Meeting done, meeting canceled. And,
Oh,
and if somebody from central office is in that meeting, meeting done, meeting canceled if you don't have an advocate with you or a lawyer with
that's
you.
good to know.
Yeah, you
Okay.
don't want to be in an IEP or a 504 meeting with someone from central office without you having somebody of equal, we'll say equal knowledge there.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So I can literally say a meeting is done.
Yeah, you can say, you know what, I didn't anticipate so and so to be here today.
Yes.
I think we need to reschedule this meeting so I can better prepare for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nicole, I wanted to just give heads up that we probably have about 15 minutes
Okay,
before
yeah. So
something, okay?
let's just do questions then. I mean, are there any other, yeah, or actually you guys had more stuff. I'm sorry, Rashmi. You had other
No, no,
parents.
no. I think we've had such an interactive event, so I think we can just have question answer and any other material you want to cover. That's all that's remaining.
Okay, okay, perfect. So yeah, are there any other questions whatsoever, any other thoughts that people want to share?
I just don't know, is everyone here from the US or is there someone international here? Yeah, just because, like, if you're not in the US, I had experience that sometimes the public system will help you more and sometimes the private system will help you more. So then it's up for you, like, you need to kind of understand the system and what will help you the most. So just this that I wanted to share. In some countries, the public will be better, and in others, the private will be better. So just adding to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the United States, there are some states where public schools are great and some states where public schools are not good. And then private schools just really vary from school to school to how much help they want to give and how willing they are to step up to the plate.
I had a question about what I'm looking at for the coming year. So my son will be going into middle school, and it's, elementary is easy to handle. You're in one classroom the whole time. And
Mhm.
he definitely, I don't know if it's like we're seeing brain fog or whatever. He's very distractible and just
Yeah.
not used to, because he didn't was homeschooled for so long. He's like not used to kind of being on the go, etc. And in middle school, they have like, 3 minutes or 4 minutes between each period. And you have to, like, they're taking attendance literally every time. You have to make sure you hand in your sheet, etc. And I'm just afraid that he won't be able to keep up. And what kind of accommodations could one ask for something like this?
Yeah, so my daughter had an accommodation where she had extended time between classes. Her campus was really, it seems like maybe that's kind of the issue, getting there really
Yeah.
quickly and kind of moving through the environment. So my daughter's school is on a campus with four different buildings and they have like 3 minutes to get there and they have to go to their locker. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is.
So she has an accommodation where I don't want her running. I don't want her carrying all of her books all day long. So she can take it what the time that she needs to get to the class. And that's been a really helpful accommodation. So just that extra time between classes. Yeah, because 3 minutes is not a lot of time. What's going to happen is the kids are running up and down the hallways and kind of just rushing to get places.
Okay.
Yes, like Jessica was also asking about accommodations for brain fog. Like what could you help recommend for brain fog accommodations? We are really struggling with that in the
Yeah.
town.
Yeah, absolutely. So brain fog is, I would be really looking at extended time. I would be looking at having homework written down for kids and assignments written down for them. Because when you have, my daughter has really bad brain fog, and there have been times she come home like, yeah, I didn't know I had a quiz today, but I don't remember someone telling me about that, you know. And so getting her homework, either she writes it down and the teacher checks it so we know we didn't miss anything, or the teacher writes it down for her. That has been really helpful for her in the past. Um, Getting notes done by teachers or getting notes from friends can be really helpful for kids that have brain fog. Because if you have brain fog and you're listening to a lecture, it's really difficult for you to take notes and pay attention. You're just going to miss stuff, right? So thinking about how can we make sure the kid doesn't miss this academic material? Can they audio tape the class lecture so that they can go back and listen to it later, or that mom and dad can go back and listen to it with them, make sure they didn't miss anything. And so those are really good, I think, accommodations for kids with brain fog. Um, extended time to do homework, extended time to do tests is really important as well. But really just making sure they're not missing that academic information. So whether they're getting notes or they're able to videotape, audio tape their lessons, writing down their homework. Does anyone else have any ideas for brain fog?
I want to add one because this kind of ties into the extended time and what if they get fatigued. You can also ask for accommodation to break up their like an exam or a test or an assignment into separate days so that they don't have to complete it all in one day. They can continue in a separate day, and that can be
Yeah,
helpful.
absolutely. Absolutely. Kids with brain fog too, often will, you can make an argument for, um, verbal answers as opposed to written answers, because it's easier for some kids with brain fog to just like talk out what they think as opposed to thinking about it and then getting it onto paper. That is a very difficult process in learning, is to have a thought and get it out on paper. And if you have a kid with brain fog, it's an extra step that maybe we can eliminate by just having those oral tests, those oral assignment completions. Do those accommodations help you guys, or do you have any other suggestions for brain fog accommodations?
Um, there is one question here. Like my son has his IAP entering into kindergarten this year. His IAP does very briefly mention his SJIA, but there are no accommodations for modifications in regards to that. How should I go about adding these things to it, or request a separate 504 meeting?
Sure. Yep. So we can do either. So we can request a 504 plan, or we can request an IEP meeting. So you can request both an IEP or a 504 at any specific time. So even though like specifically an IEP has a an annual date, you need one every year, you can still request it as often as you want. You can request modifications to that. And so for an IEP, you're kind of looking at, if we want to add it to the IEP, does their disability meet one of the 13 disability classifications for an IEP? Um, and there are a few that, and I'm just pulling up the list on my phone here. There are a few that SJIA kids can meet the classification for IEPs. Um, so the easiest one to meet classification for SJIA would be OHI, which is other health impairment. And so for a lot of kids, you can make an argument that if their SJIA is impacting their education, right? So that's the other thing is to get an IEP and your child already has an IEP, so it's easier to add things to an IEP when they already have one. But still, technically, you would have to make an argument that their SJIA is impacting their education to the point where they need specialized instruction for SJIA, which is possible, but it's also possible they would just need a 504. So I guess can that person maybe, if they feel comfortable, provide a little bit more information about their kid and how SJIA is impacting them, if they're comfortable?
In the meantime, I have a question about that because
Okay.
I tried getting my daughter IEP. This is back when she was in her worst time, about three years ago, and they did everything they through the other health. What is it called?
OHI, other
Yeah,
health and parents.
OHI, and they brought everybody the the physical therapist, occupational therapist, psychologist, everything. And so they did say she did qualify for the physical therapist and occupational therapist
Okay.
counseling, but she did not qualify for an IEP. They said because they did a test and that she supposedly passed. They did forgot what the test, I guess, to know where their academic levels are at. So I
Right.
did not know that that had to do with an IEP, that you had to be failing.
So you don't have to be failing. Every state has a slightly different, whether it's spoken or unspoken regulations. Like in Virginia, we talk about, is the child 2 standard deviations below the norm, right? So we talk about, like, is this disability impacting the child's education to the point that the child needs special education services? One of the main differences between a 504 and IEP is that an IEP has goals and objectives, and those goals and objectives are educational goals and objectives. So the question is, like, does the disability impact the learning to the point where the child needs specialized instruction and modifications to their academic? Um, a lot of the time, that's not going to be the case for an SJIA kid unless they have other disabilities as well. So you could have an SJIA kid that, has a reading disability, and then it's hard to separate what is brain fog from SJIA and what is reading disability. And so those things kind of get meshed together a little bit, and that kid is going to meet criteria for an IEP, because they have a reading disability, but also because they have SJIA and it causes brain fog and things like that. And if you have brain fog, you probably have the best argument for an IEP if you have significant brain fog from SJIA, because that brain fog is going to impact your education, and it probably is going to impact the way you access curriculum and access material. And if you have significant brain fog, you might benefit from a special education teacher breaking things down for you a little bit more precisely than what a gen ed student would need. But just because you have SJIA, that's not going to meet criteria for an IEP.
Okay, so that was my question about my son. So he's in pre-K now, but he will be going into kindergarten next year. And the school does service him once a week for his speech and language IEP. And I've just have been so unsure if they would add things. I actually work at this school. So I've spoken with the TST director, and she says that, it's in her experience, it's been pretty difficult for them to add, some OHI or other like medical things to the IEP. So she was the one who recommended the 504. But after listening to you, he I don't know if he would need some accommodations to the curriculum or not yet, because he's not in kindergarten yet. I do know that, in pre-K, what he struggles with, but obviously it's not as academically demanding as it is in kindergarten, or it will be in kindergarten. So
Sure.
just getting through the day, when he gets home, he crashes. Like there's no time after school to play or anything like that. It's pretty draining for him just to get through the day. So thinking of like homework, I don't know how that's going to go. He has a really difficult time in the mornings. We still get to school on time, but he's also not expected to, as soon as he gets there, start working. They're really good about just kind of letting him chill and all that kind of stuff. So I don't really I don't really know what my next step should be.
Yeah, it sounds like in your case, I would recommend getting a 504.
Okay.
And I think that you will know midway through kindergarten if he needs an IEP, and then you can
Okay.
re-examine that. But going
Okay.
into kindergarten, I would go in with a 504. It's going to be hard to get him an IEP because he's just starting kindergarten.
Mhm.
You're going to need to really show that it impacts his education if it does.
Okay.
That's what I would recommend.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Is there any information you can help us with for high school?
Yeah, so what specific question do you have about high school?
Well, my daughter is going to start next year and it's a whole new district. And I'm not really worried about the personal kind of accommodations, I suppose, like elevators and stuff, more for separate teachers. Because usually the teachers communicate more with the students versus the parents, and in eighth grade right now, it's me with the teachers a lot too. So like just high school usually, I guess, follow the same kind of protocol as maybe junior highs.
I mean, the high school environment and the junior high environment are different, right? So then there is that need for maybe additional accommodations just because they are going to this new, more big kid environment. So you are absolutely right. When you get to high school, and most high schools, the parents are kind of pulled out of the equation a little bit more. My daughter is in ninth grade this year, first year of high school. We have more communication with her teachers than probably the other kids do, what other parents do. So you might want an accommodation for to have more communication with the teachers. Um, Things like your child's gonna have a lot of different teachers and a lot of different expectations and a lot of different rules. Um, I don't know that there needs to be an accommodation there, but I would recommend, especially going into a new school, especially being a high school in a different type of environment. Um, every year for my daughter, when she has new teachers, I preemptively reach out to them, and this is my kid's story, and this is what I need you to know about her, and this is what I need you to do. And also, if you see these things, I need you to contact me, right? And so I think from the parent perspective is really like preemptively giving them that information. And then if you can, like I have, she started high school this year. For us, it's the same school, but she goes to a different building because it's high school. But I met with the principal before we started school. I met with the nurse before we started school just to make sure we were all on the same page about what needed to be done. Um, so I'd recommend you doing that. What what other concerns are you having besides the communication piece going into high school?
Just hoping she is well enough to go to school. And I'm just hoping they're going to be as accommodating as this district we've been part of for 20 some years. With all three of my kids they've been amazing with Alyssa, but
Yeah.
just worried about a new district, you know. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I totally understand that.
brand bigger.
Right. Yeah, so what I really recommend is making sure that your 504, when you leave the district that you're in now with the teachers that you know and they know what's best for your kid, at the end of this year, making sure that 504 is solid. So you want to go to your new school with the best 504 you could. And then you want to meet with the principal and meet with the nurse. And if you can meet with some of the teachers with that 504 in place and make sure they understand what it says and what the accommodations are. But if you go into that school with a written document, if you have a written document with everything that your kid needs, they should honor those accommodations.
That's perfect. Thank you very, very much.
Sure, absolutely.
Mia is asking about tutoring here. Like her daughter is in 8th grade. She has a high school math. And she asked the school about tutoring, and the school said they cannot provide. So she's kind of she has a private tutor. So would she qualify for more support from the school? Because she's now like she has a private tutoring.
No, so tutoring is not going to be something that's provided through a 504 typically. I've never heard of it being provided. So, if she had an IEP, she could get resource help. You can get resource help if the child is missing school. So if there is this, my child is missing school because of a lot of medical appointments, you could ask for an accommodation for them to go to. In our school, it's called the resource teacher, and they can provide some extra instruction. But traditional, like just regular tutoring, if like my child is struggling with math and maybe just math, no, you're not going to be able to get a tutor for that.
Okay. We're almost out of time. If there's any last question or two, let's do that. But otherwise, maybe wrap up. And we have recorded the video. We'll edit it. So it will be available on the channel. But it's time for one or two more questions.
And I'm gonna advance my slides here because these are just more examples. But I want to, on the last slide, this is my email address, and I asked Rashmi if she was okay with me sharing my email address. If people have any other questions, they can email me there.
And we hope to continue our work with Nicole and maybe have another event in a few months.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.